Those were the winners from 2016. And actually, the video that played right after that from the University of Miami, they won our award for a campus community partnership. And what's today? Today's Monday. In 1 week, we will be back in Orlando for the Florida Campus Compact annual conference and another awards gala. So if you're around and would like to come join us, come see me. And I think one of our panelists is still on the way. He is the Assistant Superintendent for Orange County Public Schools here in Orlando. But we are honored to have with us the Chancellor of the Florida College System, Dr. Madeline Pumariega. I hope I didn't mess that up too bad. Madeline has a beautiful history in higher ed from Miami-Dade College, which is arguably the largest college in the world, probably, about, I think, 160,000 students. She was one of the campus presidents and a dean and instructor prior to that time. And so her history with Florida Campus Compact goes back to when she was actually on a campus, but now she serves as the chancellor of the 28 state colleges. Some of you may think of them still as community colleges, but there are 28 of them, and they offer a number of bachelor degree programs now, in addition to the traditional AA degree or industry certification for job workforce development. And also Dr. Joe O'Shea, who is the assistant provost. I started to say, I got the assistant part wrong. Assistant provost at the Florida State University, of which I am a proud alum, and happy to be able to share a dais with him, and he has a lot of great insights. He was also you were the student body president at Florida State, right, when you were a student, and then he has a really impressive student resume in addition to his professional resume, where he is now the assistant provost. So I'm honored to call both of them my friend, and we're in for a great treat. Let me give a little bit of background, if I could, and then we'll go to questions and have these folks offer opening remarks, and hopefully maybe by then the assistant superintendent from Orange County will be here. My background started, I was actually at FSU. I was an intern in the legislature. I spent the first 15 years of my career at the Capitol building as a member of legislative staff, and then with the executive board, the governor and cabinet. And after that was the first half of my career. I ended up in higher ed. And what I wanted to clarify if you're not in education, can you raise your hand? Okay, so just in case, if you've never heard the term service learning, just a quick thing, you heard it mentioned several times in the video. Service learning is a way to incorporate community service or public problem solving into any course discipline, whether it's math or science, or, for example, if you're taking a biology class, you could help the Water Management District get rid of invasive species and plant trees. Whatever your service is, it's tied to the goals and objectives of your course. So you're actually learning by doing. And we used to have an old saying, it was called learn to serve and serve to learn. So way back in the day when we were still talking about volunteerism, we've come all the way over to civic engagement through community service in some ways. But I think there's hopefully that's a broader definition than just the civic education piece, which we've been talking a lot about, but interestingly enough, and what I want to throw out as a sort of overlay is how far we have come in that language. So we've gone from volunteerism to true civic engagement through being involved in your community or involved in trying to solve a public problem. But interestingly enough, I wasn't sure I was going to go here with this, but since Chris Hand brought it up, the language that we use is really important, and the folks who are here right now, even including when the assistant superintendent comes, are all involved in public education, which means that we're funded by the legislature. And Florida Campus Compact is housed at Florida State University, but we work with everyone around the state, public, private, 2-year and 4-year. But the idea has always been that we are nonpartisan, that civic engagement and taking pride in your community and problem solving was not partisan. It wasn't political. It was the right thing to do as an American citizen, or even as an immigrant who's come to call this your home. And lately there have been a few folks who have sort of come up and said, oh no, look what's happened over all these years, that there's a vast conspiracy happening, right? We're all in a major conspiracy to take over and turn these people into activists. And so I'll tell you one quick story, Chris Hand, you need to hear this. I went to see a legislator last session, and as a part of the Sandra Day O'Connor Act, middle school students are taught about civics, and they're encouraged to be engaged in the community, and they have usually a service project that's involved, but they also write letters to their legislators. Well, I happened to walk into this one particular legislative leader's office who was just, he had the letters in his hand, and he was walking around the office, and I thought, oh great, what good timing, this is not good. But the thing is these students had written to him in a way that was disrespectful, grammatically incorrect, not well formatted. It certainly didn't say the honorable. I think one of them started out with, hey dude. And it was like a lot of, how dare you, who do you think you are, that kind of stuff. And so I think, while on the one hand we've come a long way and we're doing some really important work, on the other hand, that probably wasn't the best example of it. And then two, there's terminology that doesn't resonate well with some of the leadership currently. And I was in a committee meeting the other day, and it was some K-12 people, and they were talking about social emotional development. They were talking about bullying, actually. It was completely unrelated to anything we're talking about here. But I say this to say that one of the senators said, what do you mean by social? And so I think the chancellor is going to maybe speak to this a little bit when we get in a minute. I'm going to toss a question at them, and we're going to talk about the current environment and how can we, and I love what you were talking about in your speech at lunch with how do we get everyone around the table, that we can come to a terminology that is about talking about how do we get everyone home safely as opposed to blue lives, black lives. How do we get past the language barrier, and how do we do better at what I think we do a pretty good job with each other locally, around the dinner table, around our neighborhoods, around our friends, and around even the broader circle of acquaintances. But how do we resonate and connect with some of the leadership now? So with that as a backdrop, Chancellor, you all are under remember, these are the state colleges, so the 28 community and state colleges. You guys are under a really strong mandate with performance measures, and all the state colleges, their funding is based on these performance metrics. And one of the mandates I hear over and over in the halls of the legislature is, 2 years. An AA degree shouldn't take any more than 2 years. Get them out, get them into a job, get them into an industry certified position. Talk about how does that comport with what we're talking about here and the need to educate the whole student.
Great. Thank you, Dee Dee. And I would just want to, before we start, there's probably no bigger champion in Florida than Dee Dee, who's really dedicated her life's work to this. And so I want to thank you, because so much has been done in Florida because of your continued leadership and your passion. So I want to thank you for that. So we'll go, big picture. You asked me about the accountability question. Why does accountability or performance dollars matter, don't matter? How does it set the culture or not? I think, so our colleges, you think about 28 colleges, 800,000 students across the state. When students graduate from high school, if they choose to go to college in Florida, about 65% enroll in one of our 28 colleges. Regardless of what our name is, we're the community's college. Florida got that part right, that we were going to make sure that there was college access within a certain miles from your home. 50 miles today, that's probably larger space, but that we cared about access. And higher education, for the most part, when you think about the community college system, was built on access. Finish high school and get to college. There was that time that your high school diploma was enough to get you into the middle class. And then we saw the knowledge economy. We've seen everything come of age, and that no longer is the case. The truth is, if you complete high school and a year later you're not enrolled in any post-secondary credential, you're making about $8.13 an hour, and you're making about $16,000 a year, and you're in poverty. And you think about 47%, according to Alice's United Way reports, are people who live just paycheck to paycheck. How are you going to be civically engaged and minded if you're just wondering when your next meal is, when the economic security that is your reality takes your breath away? And I say that to you because completion does matter. We had an access-driven agenda, and I think we've done that, access to higher education. And then we started to measure the output, how many were getting to the finish line. So we've been really good, and we've been funded on inputs. And universities do this better than anyone. They manage inputs, and they have the output, right? Open college systems like our community colleges don't. Everyone comes in. And so we started to measure the output. And that's tough, because somewhere that sits and isn't part of our mission, and why 2 years and 100% graduation or 150% graduation. But let me tell you why it's important in the context of this conversation to measure that number. Because if the Florida college system is the access to higher education in Florida, and if the students that we're serving, 1 and 2 come from low-income homes, and 1 and 2 are first in their families, we lead the country in completion rates, 150%. That means that a 2-year degree that we measure nationally at that 150% mark, 3 years. We lead the country. Our graduation rate as a system is about 36%. Some of our institutions are at about 60%, others are a little lower. Quite frankly, that's not going to be enough to advance this civic engagement conversation. If we're bringing students to the door, but they're not getting out and they're not finishing so that they can create some type of economic prosperity, a path to their own economic independence, it's very hard to drive civic engagement in the way that we want to drive it in 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0. And so our colleges aren't shy about having to put some dollars at risk in performance to have that measured. I think the other part of it is you just have to manage how much do you put at risk, because you're not going to control your input. You're going to continue to be an open access institution, and as we do, then what does that look like in the days of performance incentive measures, which is certainly not Florida unique. But across the country, you have places like Ohio that 100% of their funding comes from performance incentive dollars to open access institutions. So to us, the opportunity right now is looking at how do we put students on a pathway to completion? How do they come in the door? Many of them might be doing a certificate program, maybe an associate's in science, our traditional Associates of Arts, which is still the gateway to our universities. Here's what we know. Of 54% of the students enrolled in our universities that are juniors and seniors came from our Florida college system. So the ecosystem is a strong ecosystem. What they're picking up, whether it's K-12 on civics, we're seeing that extended into our colleges. And then when students arrive onto the universities, they have the same grade point average at par with that native university student that competed to get in. And I think in good part is because of the high quality of our faculty, but also all of these civic engagement and opportunities that are there for students, whether it's traveling abroad, whether it's starting a Habitat for Humanity program, whether it's understanding their role in their community. When they arrive to our universities, they're able to plug and play, although many are the first in their families to ever go. So to Dee Dee's question, I don't foresee a lot of new dollars that don't come through a path of accountability. Everyone wants to see what's the return on investment. If we're investing in this, what are the returns? And so our colleges are meeting that challenge. It's not the first time Florida does it. We did it back in like 1996, 97. We implemented performance incentive programs. I joke because our colleges make $2 million feel like a dollar, and universities find a way to make $2 million go into $2 billion. But our first performance incentive program was with our colleges, but it was driven on access. This one is certainly much more driven on the results of completion, retention, and job placement and earnings.
Thank you, Chancellor. I didn't mention in the beginning that I guess the reason I'm here is because of Campus Compact, but also because I am a school board member, a local elected official in my hometown. But perhaps even more important than that is that I am the mother of 3 children, all of whom are in college. So Madeline's got one of mine, and then the other 2 are at different state universities. And so my question for you, Dr. O'Shea, is on the ground where you are, because I hear this from my kids all the time, Mom, I want to take this elective. I want to do this study abroad. I want to do this experience. And I'm like, yes, yes, yes. But the Board of Governors is saying, well, it costs us a lot of money for students to stick around in college. So we would like for them to be finished with a degree, a 4-year degree with 120 hours, right? So graduate in 4 years. And so how do you, again, address the whole notion of their civic engagement and their overall growth in that context of the 120-hour mandate?
It's a great question. First, thank you for having me on this panel. I'm joined here by some great colleagues from Florida State, Steve Mills, Earl Clay, and some others from FSU. Thank you all for being here. So this week I will be at UCF at the Board of Governors meeting, and we will again be talking about these questions. Getting students to finish within 4 years is the most frequently discussed topic in public universities right now in Florida. And as part of the performance-based funding metrics, we have shifted to not only consider access to the institution's graduation rates, but also post-graduation outcomes, right? We are also judged, our performance funding, based on how well our students after they leave, measured somewhat narrowly by how well, what the salaries are of our students when they leave. Are they in further education or are they employed? If you said a generation ago, the university's budgets are going to be dependent upon the salaries of your graduates, people would have thought that was totally unreasonable. But in today's discussions, that is very much a part of what we deal with and part of our role in higher education, and increasingly embraced, that we have a role to prepare students for their many roles, the many roles after they leave. They're not just employees when they graduate. People are also family members and friends and neighbors and citizens. And in honoring the commitment from the legislature to help get the students through in 4 years, we have to design educational environments that help students progress on time, but also in a really formative way so that their post-graduation outcomes are on par with their peers. Florida State's been working on this for a really long time on student success, and we are just now rounding out a case study with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as a national role model in how do you get students to the finish line, the graduation rate, within 4 years, and then how do you move them to launch them successfully after into employment or further education. Florida State is actually the highest ranked institution in the country that has parity among graduation rates among its students. So students from lower income backgrounds, different demographic groups, all are graduating at the same rate, over 80% now from Florida State, which is a really remarkable achievement and something that the Gates Foundation is part why they selected FSU as a case study institution. So I say that because the question is, well, how did you get the students to graduate and at such high rates and help launch them successfully from the institution? So part of my role in the provost office, though I get to work with all sorts of challenges and problems, is to help make sure that the educational environment we're designing for young people is as formative as possible. And part of that means that the kinds of things we know that are most formative. In the educational literature, they call these often high-impact practices, or HIPs. Things like civic or service learning or community-engaged learning, internships, international study, undergraduate research, the kinds of things that build the skills and knowledge and foundation to underpin membership in public life we make sure that those are available to as many students as possible. Now, the debate about access and graduation rates has evolved now, and people are increasingly looking at, well, we have lots of civic education, international study, internships in DC, all sorts of things, but unfortunately, it's often that the wealthier students are the ones participating in those. How do we as a system and as higher education do this at scale? How do we make sure that every student, regardless of family background, can participate? So it's not that if you're a wealthy student, you go overseas to London to do some study or intern in Parliament, you go to DC and do an unpaid internship, you do research on environmental concerns in California, and you spend lots of time volunteering and in civic and service learning courses, that every student can have those kinds of opportunities. So we're looking very seriously at how we scale those opportunities, and we know that from the research is very clear, when students do those kinds of things, they have higher GPAs, they retain, they graduate, and they have higher post-graduation outcomes. So there's so much alignment in what we are trying to do here in this conference in building civic capacity for our students, and the kind of dialogue that our Board of Governors are having in trying to promote four-year graduation rates for our students.
And the students who think their parents are wealthy, so they should be going on study abroad. Well, thank you. I think Dr. Hara has joined us from the Orange County School System, and I'll let the higher ed group wrap up one thought, and then we'll switch a little bit to the Sandra Day O'Connor Act and see how public schools are doing. So one question I want to throw at both of you: we at Florida Campus Compact would argue not every single solitary faculty member is interested in or would be good at doing service learning. But for those who are, and for those who are willing to take the training to make sure it's a high quality, symbiotic partnership with a community partner and a high quality learning experience or high impact, as Joe mentioned, excuse me, we believe we can find ways to look for civic learning outcomes in any academic discipline. Let's just say testing the lead-based paint at a public school district, for example. We had that happen in Leon County. Some well-intended faculty members came with their students to test our paint. I'm sorry, our water. And we said, and I, of course, I'm being a service learning proponent, I'm a member of the board. I'm like, yes, great. Guess what? We had lead and no money to fix it. So there can be sometimes those unintended consequences can happen. What is your thought on looking for civic learning outcomes in lots of different disciplines and how we can try to accomplish that? Chancellor?
You want to go first?
Oh, sure. So part of the dialogue in helping students prepare for post-graduation outcomes or post-graduation success now is making sure students are career ready, right? Career competent. And most of the higher education partners at the university level are using something, a list called the NACE companies, the National Association for Colleges and Employers, have identified 10 competencies that help young people become career ready and are the kinds of employees that employers want to hire. Now, that list includes things like critical thinking, having the kind of empathy so you can work in teams and collaborate, the kind of global awareness and competencies that you can work with diverse teams. And as a higher education professional, what I look for in helping design and invest in programs, these kinds of attributes and skills that NACE is trying to build, you see those across every discipline. Those are core fundamental skills that are in every department and part of what we want to produce in higher education. So what's great is that that even though much of the dialogue is about helping young people get good jobs, we can do much of the civic education kind of work and building the same foundational skills that translate across across their many roles in their lives as employees or as citizens. And we also know that making sure that we're preparing students with those skills is really important. Higher education is society's last mass effort to shape the character and trajectory of young people. And it's a very important responsibility we have. And we do that all the time, influencing students, but we have a real responsibility to make sure that we do that well and try to imbue that across the disciplines and in every space. And it's certainly possible to build those foundational skills and help students learn how to deploy those skills to help contribute to communities.
Great answer. I think, so there's, without a doubt, a student who's academically engaged on campus is more likely to be academically successful. In order to go through accreditation, you have to have learning outcomes, and learning outcomes are mapped to every single course taught in an academic program. I think the greatest challenge for us in the past few years and moving forward is the new learner. Whether it's a returning mom of 3 coming back to finish her degree, and that makes up the Florida college system student, or a high school student that just graduated with 15 or 30 credits under their belt. How do we leverage technology? This is the generation that puts up GoFundMe and is generous and will fund a friend to have a project for $10 or $15, or will fund a family struggling with cancer. This is that generation. This is that generation that understands that for those that have some more money, if they buy Tom's, there's a pair of shoes that's going to be donated. This is also the generation that says to itself, why do we have food scarcity? Why do we have homelessness? Why are we volunteering to put shoes, and why don't we have shoes on every child? And so how do we, as 21st century educators in this work, meet the 22nd century leader and student? And so I don't know that the challenge is saying we've got to have these learning outcomes and these learning objectives and all the measurements. It's more about engaging at high levels. How do you make sure that the depth is there? Not just the activity-based way to earn credit, but did you really get an understanding how this plays critical into your role as a citizen? And what does that look like, and what does that feel like? This is also the generation who every other day on a Monday national news leads with a mass shooting in the United States that isn't necessarily outside of this country, and they're dealing with that as well. So I have hope. I have hope that this is the generation that says the dialogue needs to be deeper, that we spent being the generation of awareness, of validating that volunteering in your community mattered. I think that this could be the generation of learners, whatever they are and however their backgrounds are in our colleges and universities, that drive a real depth in the discourse that America's having right now. And so I have that hope, and I think that our faculty are going to be the catalyst to having laboratories in their classroom that allow for that allow every voice to be heard, even if it's a dissenting voice and not a popular voice, that it's much better heard in one of our academic laboratories than it is outside feeling alone in it, that we can have that discourse and dialogue.
I'm so glad you said that about the GoFundMe and those things, because I'll tell you a story real briefly, and then we'll switch to K-12. We had a service learning, we had a phone call at our office one day, and there was a couple of student leaders and a couple of AmeriCorps Vistas, and they were really concerned about what was happening, and they had this faculty member that was calling her class a service learning class. But what she was really doing was saying, bring in extra canned goods for the food drive for Thanksgiving, and you'll get extra credit, which is not what service learning is, by the way. But anyway. But what this resulted in was a real dialogue with the students, with the faculty member around hunger, and how can I ask my classmates to go buy some canned goods for this food drive, for this charity, for extra credit, when they're starving themselves. And so I can't tell you how many of our campuses today have a food pantry and or a community garden on their campus that would either serve their employees and or the students themselves, because some of our students are giving and giving and giving and still also in need in some ways. And so back to what we were talking about that earlier, about how do you become civically engaged when you're impoverished yourself. I never cease to be amazed by our students, and so thank you for bringing that point up. So, Dr. Hara, before you arrived, we had a little bit of a really great presentation by Chris Hand, who co-authored the book with Senator Graham, America, the Owner's Manual, and they were very instrumental, along with Doug Dobson, with actually getting the Sandra Day O'Connor Act into law in 2010, I think it was, about. So, as an administrator now, here we are 7 years later, and as an administrator over a sizable school district, a great school district, I might add, I'm a proud Boone alumni, what are the problems in the implementation? What are the challenges and the opportunities in implementing this bill and civics education in the middle school and high school grades?
And thank you, and I apologize for my tardiness. I guess I'm trying to leave the office. So it's usually a challenge when it's local, trying to leave your office. But as it was mentioned, Orange County, we have over 191 schools, 208,000 students on a regular basis. We've been growing 5,000 students a year here in Orange County Public Schools, and I actually just got the latest report. We have received an influx of close to 2,000 students from the hurricane from Puerto Rico as of this morning. So close to 2,000 students. So we're growing, and as a district, you know, back when you look at in the last several years with the law and really implementing our civics education, we have seen an increase in our test scores, right? So, and how do we measure success, at least for what student engagement in our classrooms? You know, it's been an important issue for us to bring civics into 7th grade, and something that we're proud of, and seeing an increase in U.S. history. The challenge, I would say, is, you know, that we're looking at the limited opportunity, and I would say in the elementary grade levels, right? And really with the high accountability that we celebrate here in Florida, and in Orange County we do as well, is how do we find the time in the elementary grade levels, right, when we have so many you know, accountability measures in ELA and math and sciences. How do we fit it all in? And now all the different mandates that are coming with physical education and recess and everything else. So it's where do you find the time, because we're not extending the day. So at the elementary grade level, so then there's students. So the positive has been that we have seen it in, at least in 7th grade. For us, we have looked at our support from the district level to the school and aligning, and I think the standards have been really important, and what the state of Florida has released, you know, at high level standards. So we have, I would say, better curriculum than what was done in the past. So it's high level. So the support there, professional development, really for our teachers to implement. In our high schools, you know, we really push with the U.S. history, the American history. One of the things that we have seen is we have seen an increase in our students taking some college level courses in the American history, AP government, and economics. So there's been an interest for our students, and I think that's a success. Now, I would say the opportunities, we don't call them challenges here in Orlando, in Orange County. We like to say is opportunity. How do we improve? And I gave you the notion of seeing this is the conversation that we constantly have, right? As we see so many of our fellow citizens from Puerto Rico, and we've seen an increase of our immigrants from South America and from other places, is how do we really change and have that civic mind conversation? So hearing from the chancellor, and I never thought about it, with they're always giving, in our new populations, how do we capitalize that, and so we can then take advantage of it? So as we continue to see the increase in test scores, and we continue to see the possibilities, how do we engage them within our community? We see pockets in our Interact, in our student government associations, in our civic mind activities after school, because we, you know, as a former principal and as a former science teacher, I know kids didn't come to school to learn biology. Kids come to school for the other aspect of a school. And how do we then engage them into a school? So as the chancellor mentioned, having positive engagement after school, we see that those are the students that are successful. So it's how do we engage that student that's new to the American public school system that they're not used to in their homeland, and how do we engage them into the American system so that we can see the success as they leave us. Once they leave K-12, whether they go to work, they're a successful citizen. So that's where I see the opportunity, and we're hopeful with the work. But I think going back to the success of the implementation of the bill is that, you know, really the focus has been really targeted for civics and then the U.S. history. So we're, you know, we're hopeful.
That's great. You know, I'm sure I'm dating myself now, but when I went to school in Florida, how many people went to high school in Florida? How many of you, keep your hand up, did you take Americanism versus communism? Do you remember? I don't remember. I hardly remember very many of those courses. Do you remember reading Animal Farm? And I mean, I remember that back then, everybody watched the Olympics, and the only thing anybody cared about was whether we had more gold medals than Russia, right? And look where we are now. It just caused me to kind of scratch my head. So, Chancellor, share with our friends here some of the concerns with some of the members of the legislature and the governing bodies about Americanism and socialism and capitalism and those topics.
I think that what you saw this legislative session, and as you all know, we again took one piece of legislation and led again in making sure that we want students who graduate with a degree to have civics literacy. And we did that back in like 1999. Florida looked at computer competency. It was clear that we were really moving to this gig economy then. And we required students to either take a introduction to computer course or take a computer competency test. And we're headed back in that direction. Either it'll be a civics course or a civics test. But I think what we shouldn't lose sight of is that the real dialogue, and it happened, you saw during the election cycle this time. So, you know, candidate Bernie Sanders said free college. And so what did that do to college students across Florida and across the country? Free college, this is great, I want to support this candidate. Never the question about how do you pay for that? So that whole question about civics and the economy, I think, has surfaced from what I've heard and seen in the comments about, do we really understand our economic structure in America? And how do we help students? First, how do we help children? How do we help kids? How do we help students? And how do we help adults navigate what that means? Through it. And so I think that that's something that has come from the whole notion on the civics education most recent bill coming out and what you'll see. And I think the opportunity for our colleges and our universities, many of the students will opt out and maybe take a test. That isn't really the notion of it. The notion of it is really understanding civics and the entirety of it, from being engaged in your communities to understanding the election cycle and being active in your local and state and federal elections, but it also means what kind of policies have impact on you and how do you ask those critical questions that are important for you to make an informed decision as someone in your community, a leader, a voter, or someone speaking about it.
So I think part of the conflict kind of sometimes is that the legislature, and I worked in that process for years, I have the utmost respect for the process and the people who are committed to being willing to run for office, that, you know, they have ideas of their own, and they have their own children who have their own experiences in school, and so they come and so for example, last session I think there was a bill to mandate recess in K-12. There was a bill, which I agree, kids need to run around, okay? But there was a bill, there's now another one coming back again around financial literacy. The idea about civic engagement is important. And so the balance that we try to find, to try to strike is how do we try to accomplish all of these things which are really worthwhile endeavors, things we want our students to be civic-minded and career-ready, and for their, to be able to run around and exercise when they're little, because they come to school, they want to. They want to play, and they want to. That's where their creativity comes in. The whole idea about the STEM versus the humanities, right? The humanities. There are a lot of high-tech companies that are now employing folks who have a degree in the humanities, because they know that the creativity piece is really important to problem solving. And so I think if I'm still back to our lunch speaker's great point about if we can find the language, I'm not sure we're not all saying something that's pretty similar, but the language seems to really matter in the way that we frame it, so that we can all be on the same page talking about that. So, and back to the K-12 piece, and I'll turn it to questions from the audience. It strikes me that, I don't know if you're aware, but nowadays in middle school, you can take high school classes, and in high school, you can take dual enrollment college classes, and then you can graduate from high school at the same time with your AA degree already in some cases. And then, and so I'm just wondering about how this impacts the work that we're talking about. How do we accomplish everything we've talked about trying to accomplish in that context? And it looks like the superintendent has something to say.
So no, and I think it's a great question. I believe when you really look at the requirements, first of all, I guess into the guidance, guiding the students, right? Because when you look at the engagement of kids, because some of the things that we've seen in our data, that our students that are, I go back to the Chancellor's comments, the students who are engaged in school are the ones that are doing everything else.
Yep.
Right, so you have the class president, you have the Interact president, you have some of this that are leading your campus leaders. They're also the ones that are finishing with an AA.
Yep.
They're also the ones that are most likely in the band or in the football team. They're just part of that entire school. So you rarely have, you do have some of the science, STEM expert, our students that are just focusing that math, and they're doing the dual enrollment, and they're going to the universities, graduating with 30 credits. As a chancellor mentioned, we have plenty of students that graduate with 30 college credits, and we also have those same students in middle school that go into high school with 5 high school credits already. And we're very proud of really accelerating the learning for our children. We do. You look at our Algebra 1 in 7th and 8th grade math, you look at and very proud to say that in Orange County, we are leading the state with students taking Algebra 1 in 7th and 8th grade. So some of these kids are going into high school with 2 high school credits. So I think it opens up their choices when they get to high school. So then they can take some of the more fun courses if they're saying, well, I'm going to take some of the AP world history, the AP European history. It gives them that opportunity to do that while they're with us. So it's not that we want them to leave to go to the community college, to the college, state colleges earlier. It's how do we open up access for them to take more of those fun electives while they're still with us, because it's not the best. And I know the higher ed institutions, they don't want some 17-year-olds to go in as juniors, right? Because they're still developing. So it's how do we then open up the access while they're with us to keep them with us in our K-12. So
That's true. Joe, did you want to say?
Well, it's true that this it's like an escalator that's never stops moving, and it's accelerating, and and you feel like you're a treadmill. I think that it's hard when you're on that kind of accelerated treadmill to see other possibilities in life, and it's also hard to make decisions when you have very few data points from which to draw on to make decisions about how you want to use your talent and gifts to make contributions. And I want to go back to a point that Earl Clay said earlier, is that about imbuing young people with a sense of meaning and purpose. And we know in higher education that students are more likely to do well and to engage and to succeed after if they have that kind of sense of meaning and purpose, and they're rooted in the kind of social contributions they can make in their lives. And one worry is that and sometimes you see this in higher ed, is that when students are racing through, trying to get through as quickly as possible, is that they don't have enough opportunity and space, both in their schedules, but also the sort of mental, intellectual, creative space to explore deeply into the kind of challenges that our world is facing and to enjoy seemingly purposeless relationships with others, and diverse others, so that they can learn from them and about themselves. So there's some tension with the kind of acceleration that we're seeing and our goals to try to foster young people's growth holistically.
Right, and I think we haven't talked about issues like teen suicide and mental health and opioid epidemics and abuse among some of our students. And I never thought, ever, that one of the top things on my list of things to do as a school board member would be to go to a kid funeral. And that is true. So while we're getting a lot of stuff right, we have a lot of opportunities, excuse me, to do a lot of things better. But I'm glad, I hope that was helpful to those of you who are not in education to kind of hear how much there is to try to juggle in the higher eds or in the K-20 pipeline space, and how we try to make it as fluid as possible. But it is a unique set of challenges for sure. So questions from the audience? Dr. Jones is out there. There's one in the back.
Juris doctor. Not a real doctor.
Hi, Jay Thomas from the College of Central Florida. Forgive me for asking, this is going to be some very technical questions about the latest legislation that was passed regarding civics education. Is this going to require that both students who are going into AS programs as well as AA programs have to complete the civics requirement?
Yes, if you earn a degree. It won't be just, I think, limited to associates. It's that if you earn a degree.
Any degree, so AS, AA, BA, BS, all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, I think we're working through all of the pathways now of how do you get there. There's lots of ways you can do it. How do you keep the legislative intent in place, which is a little bit what we're all talking about. It's important. There's no doubt that we would want our students, and if you have children, that they could lay on the green grass on a college campus, look up at the blue skies, and find themselves. We in here, in a sense, gave up that dream. When we said snail mail was way too slow and the oven was much too slow, and we took on microwaves, and then we took on digital devices, and we sped up in the way that they have to learn, acquire knowledge, and be successful. That's the real reality. As a mom of a 13-year-old, I would love nothing for her than to slow down.
Yeah.
But this economy and this global world doesn't allow for it. So there is a push-pull on efficiencies and education and learning outcomes and accountability, that exactly what the provost said is true. What we sacrifice in that process is there's nothing better than a home-cooked meal in the oven that takes 2 hours. You ever have short ribs on it? It's that time that allows for it to cook. And that's true for our students. So even when you think about dual enrollment and you're taking dual enrollment, an American history course, while you're a junior and you're 16, the way you assimilate that knowledge in your life experience is very different than if you take it at 18, and certainly much different if you're a returning adult in one of our classrooms and is 40. And how the world looks like. And so I think, to your question, as we work through implementing law, which we're required to, how do you do it in a way that I think preserves the intent, but still looks at the efficiency of the focus of getting students to the finish line, and without excess credits and without additional credits and without hurting the completion rate of the college, and without creating cumbersome excess credits at the university. So we are working through all of that right now.
Great. One more follow-up, if you don't mind. The committee that was assembled to address this, can you give us a quick update as to any decisions they've made, such as which courses are going to be required, all that kind of good stuff?
That's what they're in the process. If I feel like if you were in Florida, Florida gets a lot of things right. I know that we sometimes when we come out, it seems like we didn't. But in 1995, the legislature said the Associates of Arts is going to be a 60-credit hour. There are still states who can't figure out the first 120 credits of an AA should be 60. We also said that a common numbering system meant that if you took English 1101 at Valencia College or Broward College, it's the same one that you take at FSU or UF, and that's our common numbering system. And Florida also said if you get your AA, you can articulate to our university, and our universities can't discard your credit. It's our articulation agreement. So we got those things right. I think that adding this civics course really puts in play what does that 60 look like? How does the 36 general education look like? And how do you preserve the academic rigor and integrity of what a degree is in the United States, that it is a reflection of a well-rounded individual that understands communication, appreciates the arts, knows the impact of the environment along with the psychology of self and can work in a team and has some computation skills. As you add more courses that you think are really important, the question is you're still with a finite number. So it is a group of faculty from history to economics faculty. They're all looking at curriculum and they're working through the statewide articulation coordinating council.
Okay. Yes, sir.
So one of the things we learned when we were, Scott Payne with the Florida League of Cities, but formerly with the University of Tampa as a faculty member. One of the things I think we learned a number of years ago when we put this great emphasis on writing issues and getting students to write better was we could load them up in courses devoted to writing for writing's sake, and they didn't do well. But when we connected learning to write to learning to think within the disciplines that they had passions for, they did a better job. We had better outcomes in terms of growth in writing. That's my understanding from my years of experience in working in the area. That's what I understood we learned. And so we emphasized the advanced level writing classes that were connected to their disciplines of interest, maybe their major, maybe something else. Could we not be following a similar logic when we think about civics education? And instead of making it a one-off course that everybody has to take and they check the box that has nothing to do with anything else they care about, should we not be reinventing the model so that we think about civics education as a part of our education in the sciences, as a part of our education in the arts, as a part of our education in business, that it becomes a course about being a citizen, regardless of your expertise, but from the standpoint of your passion and your expertise. That also could help with resolving some of these other issues. I don't know what the law will permit, because it wouldn't necessarily have to be a freestanding 4 credits just in civics.
That's an excellent question and a great observation. You're right. I think anything that we contextualize today is much more relevant to a student, and that's not going to be a clear choice for us, given how the law is written, that there is actually a requirement or a test that's met. It doesn't mean that it can't evolve if that first pass through, but I think that how we can contextualize education really across the board. This is a national conversation about math and algebra, and does everyone need algebra, and how do you contextualize computation skills across the entire curriculum and not limited to these 6 credits of mastery. So very insightful, and I hope it's a direction we'll take.
If I could just add something really quick, it's a really good observation too that the law is pretty narrow in its prescription of how civic education ought to be, and it's focused on civic literacy, some demonstration of certain facts, and done through either a test, the U.S. citizenship test perhaps, or one or two of the gen ed kind of courses. One particular apt analogy I think here is that one of my colleagues uses is sometimes it's better to give someone a carrot cake than to just give them the carrot. And that if you just give them the civic education, the carrot, just by itself, students, then this one-off course, as you mentioned, sometimes it's not as received as well and becoming part of their identity and skills as it would be if it was part of the carrot cake when they're engaged in a project in which they're developing the core competencies and virtues that underpin membership in public life. And it's certainly true that we can do this, and we do often do this. I mean, when students are doing the kinds of projects and co-curricular activities and going all over the world to do things, they're building the kind of skills that underpin membership in public life. And this is a particular legislative measure to try to demonstrate at least competency in one of the areas of that for citizenship and literacy. And I don't think it's realistic that we're going to see significant increases in our civic health index in Florida because of this particular bill. But it's at least a start in bringing that into the conversation for Florida.
And this is probably a bad year to remind everybody that Bob Graham is a Gator, and he used to always talk about how the football team didn't learn how to play by watching the films in the locker room, right? They got out on the field, and so I have to give a hats off to our college faculty and our K-12 teachers who are incredibly gifted at intertwining multidisciplinary approaches to this work. I've seen them combine the physical, or not the physical education, excuse me, the recess model, which is unstructured play, with creativity and drama and all kinds of things. And so I am of the opinion we can definitely look for civic learning outcomes from any number of disciplines, if not all of them. But this particular piece of legislation to which we're talking about from House Bill 7069 last year, I think will end up being within the context of our traditional gen ed curriculum. At least that would be my guess. And I think there's a question right here, front and center.
I was just going to say the committee that's considering it is made up of 10 political scientists and 10 historians, and I'm on it, and I would love to carry your feedback. So if anybody wants to come talk to me, I would love to hear.
There you go. That's great. It looks like Bob, Jack, and then over here.
Okay. Jack, you want to go first?
I want to share some great news, which is the expansion of access to college by our foster youth. 10 years ago, we had fewer than 5% of our foster youth even imagining going into a college classroom. And now we are getting in the 40% range. And that's been the leadership of your predecessor and you, Chancellor Palmeriega, and our university's leaders and our K-12 leaders, but also it's the assiduous attention to the finance part, which has been tuition waiver, which has been giving them the advantage that many middle-class families have, which is some housing and other help. College coaches is the term we use for this in loco parente, helping them to navigate the early stages of college career, and we're seeing phenomenal growth. We're also seeing a lot of these foster youth mentoring in a civic engagement way their peers in foster care, which means that if I can do it, you can do it. So that's a big ribbon of great improvement. We have a ways to go, but thank you all so much for this great advancement.
Okay, Eric.
Did you want to say something on that?
I
Hello,
did
everybody.
it. I'll come back to it. That's good.
Okay, we'll get as soon as he's.
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Okay. I'm Eric Hodges from the University of South Florida. And when I'm thinking about civic education, I'm thinking about things beyond competencies and literacies. I'm also thinking about civic values. Because, you can have the competencies, you can have the literacies, but if you don't have sort of the right value structure, you can use that in ways that are not civic. Right? So I guess my question is, what role do you think public education should play in teaching civic values?
Mr. Superintendent, you want to take that?
You said,
Is that K-12 or higher? Is that K-12 or higher ed?
He said
Sorry,
public
it's
education.
K-20.
It's K-20. So, and that, well, I mean, we play a significant role. I mean, when you really look at our students, right? I mean, the fabric of our community is they're in our K-20 school systems. More than just, and I'm glad you mentioned the importance of the competency on standards. That's important. However, I go back to is how do we engage them in our community? Something that we didn't talk about is that workforce, right? I mean, we have kids. I have my own son who's a high school senior. He's also the senior class president. He's going to graduate from high school, and he's going to go into welding because he wants to be a welder. And he's going to make a lot of money as a welder, right? But he's engaged in his community. And not just because he's my son, but that's because of the school community and that support of how critical you're part of the bigger picture of the citizenship. And I'm going to tell you, sitting at the table, sitting at the TV watching the election with your high school junior last year, right? Being involved in the process, in the political process, to me, it was very rewarding. I think it goes back to, and I was talking to the chancellor, I think it goes back, I would say it had to do with the civics class that he was in seventh grade. So to me, that's important, and it had built some of those values for him growing up and being involved. And I'm going to tell you, it was one of the only classes that I kept trying to push him. I said, why don't you go study political science? He loves politics, but he wants to be a welder. In the overall picture, I would see that he's never going to miss a day voting, right? He's asking me, tries to get into my mind who I voted for, and I said, no, none of your business. But it's that process. So if it's possible for one, I think that's what's happening in that civic and how it's taught. It's within the school. So.
And I think in the higher ed space, right, there's civics values in which you learn and you're exposed to it and you have knowledge from. And so I think they differ. There's a value set that you get at home on what you value at home. And then as you journey through education, and especially as you journey through public education, your perspective of life changes, and I hope grows and is enriched, because now you've had some life perspectives, or you've had a friend go through a life perspective. You may not have experienced racism yourself, but then you're standing in the hallway when your best friend experiences racism. And then that takes diversity to another level of value of what you think equity means, and what you might have seen not as something that was a true inequity and racism. So I think we have a place to where those conversations, as I said earlier, need to evolve. And they need to evolve with the context and in facts. So if you're thinking about whether capitalism and socialism, that you understand the push-pull of that. You understand what the framework of that is, so that you can make an informed decision of what you value. But your first set of values come from home. It's what you hear at that kitchen table. I think the second place that you start to validate some of those values are in a school setting. And then when you get to college, you really start picking those as your personal values. Which one from that tapestry are the ones that you stand firm on? And what do you really believe on? And I think that is that is the magic of higher education. That's the magic of our faculty and what you grow in a classroom through your college career.
Yeah, this is something we talk about every day at Florida State. I mean, every meeting we talk about how we develop the kind of virtues and character traits in young people, our students, that will help lead to successful lives. And it's difficult, right, to measure that and to do that, but it is something that we do every day. When I think about what kind of citizens we want, I think something that's helped me a lot is this thinker, Martha Nussbaum at Princeton. She writes about three kind of core elements that underpin modern citizenship. And the first one is this idea of narrative imagination, this idea that you can imagine the life of another person from their perspective, sort of empathetic quality of it. The second is that you have this sort of capacity to care. Your circle of concern and care is extended beyond just those immediately around you and those who look like you or think like you and talk like you, but extend much broader across the human race and beyond. And the last is the capacity for critical self-examination of yourself and society, so knowing what's happening around you and being able to dissect that and examine it in ways that you might be able to make a difference in. And so as an educator, I look across those three kind of core dimensions and think about how we build those virtues and values in young people. And it's something that we are investing pretty heavily in as a university, and redesigning curricula and designing co-curricular experiences. But I think we all feel the pressure as educators to do this. I mean, the problems we are facing in society are so enormous right now, and every day when you go in the news. It's just overwhelming, like crises, and people are very quick to look at education. Well, why didn't you do this, right? You should have solved that then. And so we feel a lot of pressure to try to give people the kind of fortitude and skills and character traits so that they can persist and be resilient in the face of so many different challenges we are facing in modern society. And so it's a responsibility we take very seriously, and we're working on it.
And can I go back
Absolutely.
to the comment on the homeless and foster? I think, and that's a great point, and something that as we try to advise, and I love the notion that as we in K-12 and all our, in K-20, really the local parentis, I go back to what I say to our school principals. You cannot allow 15-year-olds to make decisions and that impact the rest of their lives, negatively impact, because we do that in this country, right? We say, what are your electives? What do you want to take? What do you want to do, right? Because we sometimes don't want to challenge them because it may be a little bit of a challenge, right? So that notion that we have to make the decisions for the students and convince them that they can do it. And I say that because it's the plethora of choices that we have in our K-12 because of and I sit across the table with my colleagues in the higher ed costs. For some of our families, that's why they use the dual enrollment. That's why they use some of the options. Because why not do it while you're with us when it's free? Because then you can accelerate and finish. So that's kind of the challenge that we try to guide our students to say, you can earn it, which is why we love the numbering system in higher ed. Because when you're taking a dual enrollment course in a high school, that counts at Valencia and it counts at UCF. So you're with us and it's not costing you. So our population, I've been here 5 years, we've gone from a 64% free and reduced lunch student population to 70%. We have 152 schools out of the 191 that serve supper. Because our kids come to school and eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner with us at no cost. I say that to say, there are so many challenges that I always like to say, adult challenges that our children are facing. And they still come to school, and then we get them to you. So it's a piece of the puzzle that we try to guide them to then say, it's not to finish, but it's to really lower your higher ed costs so you can complete your higher ed institution. So I want to commend you on those comments because I think it's something that we're trying really hard to really minimize the costs as our kids are leaving and going to the higher ed.
So I want to say that a piece here in disaggregating all data and looking at all data, and again, where Florida does get it right. So you think about dual enrollment, not every state provides it at no cost. So our colleges are required to work in a partnership with the school district and have a shared cost process so that we can do that. That starts to level the playing field. That's about equity. If you're in another state and you have to pay. So there's these forks in the roads that we start to create the separation in terms of higher education, not just being an access point, but an equity point as well. And so whether it's vulnerable youth, foster and homeless students that in Florida have a tuition waiver, to the kind of dual enrollment programs that we try to focus on kids who are first in their families to go to college, and a rich AP course. And so I think for us, the great opportunities of a whole K-20 system is how do you ground some strong values with students all the way through? How do you make sure that through their first day till their final day through a university and into lifelong learning, it's all connected into how are you civically engaged, how are you informed, how are we building empathy and critical thinking and leaders. And I think that if we do that and we get it right at this very critical time in our country, it's our legacy, it's our future. And I often say to students, you can't get frustrated at the federal level, you've got to stay vigilant. And then you'll make decisions to make. And at the statewide level, you have to be an advocate and champion those things that are important. But within your own circle of influence, we have enormous impact that we can make. And that's the kind of impact that all of you are having, our colleges, our universities, our school district, our teachers, and our faculty, and champions out there in the nonprofit world, folks like in City Year and others that are our AmeriCorps members serving our schools. And that's what I think we have this moment to do and to get it right now.
So just to wrap it up, I'll leave you with one thought, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir when I say this, but a number of years ago when I first started in this work, I ran across this quote by John Dewey that said, "Democracy has to be reborn in every generation, and education is its midwife." And so I'm glad that you had a chance to hear some of the challenges and especially with the performance metrics and the accountability measures, of none of us are afraid of accountability. But to get it all done, we need your help. So if you're not volunteering in a school, or if you're not engaging some college students and mentoring in a school, please consider doing that as your next civic engagement experience. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much to the panel, and we're going to take a break.